So today's lab is the copper cycle laboratory. Really, I want you to view this lab as a survey of chemical reactions. We're going to be looking at a series of chemical reactions, all of which are involving copper. So the first reaction we're going to look at is oxidation of copper with nitric acid. So what I want you to do, since we just barely are starting to touch on redox chemistry in detail, I'd want you to shelve these redox numbers for now. But what I want you to focus on, in essence, is that copper is reacting with nitric acid in the presence of, so nitric acid, where our oxidizing agent is nitrate. So copper is reacting with nitrate in the presence of acid to generate nitrogen dioxide and water. And in this process, electrons are being transferred from our copper to our nitrate, okay? So we call this reaction a redox reaction. And it's where there is a transfer of electrons. We discussed oxidation numbers earlier on in this course, and as you notice, if we look at the oxidation number of copper before and after the reaction, has the oxidation number of copper changed? Has copper lost electrons? So looking at the oxidation number of copper, has copper lost electrons if it's more positively charged? Has copper lost electrons in this process? Yes. We went from copper 0 to copper +2. Likewise, the nitrogen in nitric acid went from an oxidation number of +5 to +4. So our nitrate is gaining electrons. Now, in effect, when we react copper with nitric acid, we're engaging in a redox reaction where copper is losing electrons and nitrate is gaining electrons. So in solution, in the end, in solution, we have copper 2+, which is copper nitrate, in a solution of nitric acid. So that's our first reaction. We are oxidizing copper with concentrated nitric acid, and as a result, we get copper 2+ in solution of nitric acid. In other words, we have copper nitrate in nitric acid. Okay, so that's our first reaction, and we call this a redox reaction. The next reaction that we're going to observe is a precipitation reaction. So we're precipitating our copper 2+ as copper hydroxide solid. So one thing I want you to keep in mind, hydroxide salts are generally insoluble. In fact, making the hydroxide salt is the primary way that we remove a lot of heavy metal contaminants from our common municipal waste, or industrial waste in some cases. So copper nitrate reacts with hydroxide in solution. There is an exchange of ions. We're exchanging our nitrate in copper nitrate for the hydroxide in solution, and we make copper hydroxide solid. Remind me, what do we call a solid insoluble species generated from a reaction? What do we call an insoluble species generated from a reaction? What do we call that insoluble solid that we make? What's our word for that? And you're welcome to type in chat at this time. Yep, precipitate, exactly right. So precipitate is the common phrase that we use to describe a solid generated from a chemical reaction that's insoluble in water. Okay, now if we look fundamentally at a precipitation reaction, the net what's actually occurring in our precipitation reaction is our copper ion in solution is reacting with the hydroxide ion in solution to make our precipitate. So we call this reaction a precipitation reaction, and it's an exchange reaction. Exchange because we are exchanging the ions associated with our ionic compound to generate an insoluble solid that we call a precipitate. So at the end of our second reaction, we'll have some liquid and our insoluble copper hydroxide. So this liquid will primarily be containing some nitrate, some hydroxide, some sodium plus, and we can just get rid of that liquid. That liquid doesn't have any soluble copper. And we will have, at the end of our second precipitation reaction, we will have our solid copper hydroxide. And we're going to take this copper hydroxide and we're going to subject it to further reactions. Does everyone understand, and was everyone able to recognize the different types of reaction labels for each step in this process? We'll review more of these different types of reactions, and we'll show a lot more examples of these different types of reactions next session in lecture. Does everyone understand the chemical reactions that are occurring so far? Is everyone comfortable with what's going on so far? Okay, if you have any questions, don't be shy to stop me. So the next reaction that we're going to look at is we're going to take our copper hydroxide and we're going to subject it to a decomposition reaction. Let's put a star next to that. In a decomposition reaction, we start off with one material, one reactant, and we generate two or more products. So metal hydroxides, if you heat them, you generate a metal oxide. So let's put a label for that. We generate an oxide and water. So based on this general framework for a hydroxide decomposition, my question to all of you is, if I take copper hydroxide and I heat it, what two products will I receive? So if I heat a metal hydroxide, I get a metal oxide and water. So what's our metal in this case? What's our metal that we're dealing with? Let's type that into the chat. What's our metal that we're dealing with? Copper. So then, what metal oxide will we make? What's the name of our metal oxide that we're making? Yep. More specifically, we're making copper 2 oxide. Because the oxidation number, the charge of our copper is +2. So practically the way that we're going to affect this reaction is we're going to take our copper hydroxide, which is a nice sort of gray solid, and we're going to heat it in our test tube, and we're going to observe the dark color of copper oxide. What I want you to do throughout this experiment, I want you to really pay attention to the color changes, gas formation, solid formation, and really listen to what I'm saying during each of these steps, because you really want to be able to respond to the questions in your lab report concerning any physical and chemical changes and be able to answer the questions in terms of byproducts from these reactions. Okay, so now that we have our copper oxide, we're going to process our copper oxide by reacting it in what I would consider an acid-base reaction between a metal oxide and an acid. So if we take our copper oxide and we react it with sulfuric acid, you're going to see this nice, beautiful color of copper sulfate. We've worked with copper sulfate before in previous labs and it has this really distinct deep blue color. Now, fundamentally, this reaction can be thought of as an acid-base reaction because we have sulfuric acid, which is serving as our acid, which is an H+ donor. And our oxide is serving as our base, which is accepting our protons. The oxide reacts with the hydrogens in sulfuric acid, so the base reacts with the acid to generate water. So that's why I would consider this an acid-base reaction. So we have floating around in solution now our copper 2+. And we're next going to take our copper 2+, and we're going to regenerate our copper solid by reduction of copper 2+ with magnesium. Now, remember, I know this has been a while ago since we had our spring break in between then and now, but when we discussed our activity series, activity series ranks species by reactivity as reducing agents. And when we did a lot of our experimental trials, we know that when we mixed magnesium with solutions of copper 2+, we observed a reaction. So if you see your activity series right here, if your arrow going from your neutral metal to your metal ion is pointing down, the reaction's possible. So magnesium can react with copper. Is there another case, looking at this activity series, is there another ion that magnesium can react with? Is there another ion that magnesium can react with? Is there another ion that magnesium can react with? Is there another ion? Yep, exactly right, H+. So magnesium reacts with H+ and it reacts with copper. This will be important later on because you'll see that this reaction is certainly quite vigorous. Okay, now another thing that I want you to pay attention to, if your arrow from your metal to your ion is pointing up, the reaction is disfavored. So copper is commonly used in pipes for drinking water, it used to, and it's generally thought of as a quote-unquote noble metal or pseudo-noble metal in many cases because copper is not very reactive. So looking at our activity series, would we expect copper to react with acid? Does neutral copper metal react with acid? Is copper above H+ or below? Let's really think about this, as this is critical to understanding why this works for copper. Does copper react with H+? Yes or no? So looking at it, if we compare copper and H+, is our arrow pointing up or down? Is our arrow from copper to H+ pointing up or down? Up, okay? And if our arrow is pointing up in our activity series, our reaction's disfavored. So is copper very likely to react with H+ if our arrow is pointing up on our activity series? No, exactly right. Copper is not very likely to react with H+. So copper does not substantially reduce H+. So we can have, and we can make copper 0 in acidic solution with no issues, while magnesium will react with acidic solution. And this is the beauty behind the trick for this reaction. Copper is a pretty easy metal to isolate via reduction because you can just burn off your excess reducing agent. So we're reacting our copper sulfate with magnesium in an acidic solution. And this will be important to keep in mind because this is why you'll see a pretty vigorous side reaction. So in effect, what's going on here is we're reacting copper sulfate and magnesium to generate copper solid and magnesium sulfate. We call this a displacement reaction because magnesium is displacing copper from its ionic compound. Fundamentally, this displacement reaction can be thought of as a redox reaction, where there is an exchange or a transfer of electrons. So in this case, our magnesium metal is donating electrons to our copper metal. It's donating 2 electrons. And that is why our copper goes for an oxidation number of +2 to 0, while magnesium goes for an oxidation number of 0 to +2. So this reaction involves a transfer of electrons. Okay. So this is how we'll be regenerating our copper solid. We're going to be starting with about 0.02 grams of copper, and we're going to calculate the mass of copper recovered in this reaction after isolation. So we're going to isolate our copper after all of these different reaction steps, and then from that, the one value that you'll be calculating is our percent recovery, which is the mass of copper recovered over the mass of copper starting. And just I want you to be aware, the copper needs to be dry. So you may want to think about that really closely when writing your report. If you see a mass recovery that is greater than 100%, it is likely that your sample is wet or it's not fully dry. Just something to consider. So in effect, we're going to subject an initial mass of copper to those 5 reactions we discussed previously. We're then going to record the mass of copper recovered after all of these reactions and after drying. The percent recovery is the mass of copper recovered over the mass of copper that we started with. Do the calculations make sense to everyone? Is everyone comfortable with these calculations? Does this make sense so far, what's going on? Could I get some feedback in the chat? Any questions so far? Okay. So in terms of side reactions, when we're reducing our copper, so this is our last step. This is the last step in our sequence. One really vigorous side reaction that we'll see is that the magnesium reacts readily with acid. So remember, magnesium is above H+ on the activity series. So then magnesium reacts with acid. And it reacts with acid to generate hydrogen gas. This is often why I'm very careful about where I light my flame when I'm running these reactions, so I don't accidentally light my hydrogen gas on fire. So the bubbles and the vigorous gas formation that you see when we drop our magnesium in, it's not just due to the redox reaction. The redox reaction is not that exothermic. It's this viciously exothermic reaction of magnesium with acid. And we can exploit this fact because we can rinse and remove our excess magnesium with acid. The same is true for metals such as aluminum, and that's a common experiment done in other introductory chemistry courses. So key thing and the key reasoning behind this trick, magnesium reacts with acid, copper doesn't react with normal non-oxidizing acids. Does that make sense to everyone? Does everyone understand what's going on here? This may be important to answering one of the questions on your report. So Any questions before we close out our pre-lab lecture? Any questions? Yes, you will watch the video I made and you'll report and calculate the data from my run through. Yes, that's exactly right. The video shows me going through each of these reaction steps, explaining each step along the way, and zooming in on portions where you need to take a measurement. So you'll take all measurements directly from the video. That's exactly right. If we don't have any other questions at this time, I'm going to stop this recording.